When I moved to Milwaukee in '81, I started reading pornography, going to the bookstores. Eventually that led to frequenting the gay bars. And then one time I brought this young man back to the hotel room, the Ambassador Hotel. Was just planning on drugging him and spending the night with him. I had no intention of hurting him. When I woke up in the morning, he had a broken rib here. I was heavily bruised. Apparently I had beaten him to death with my fists.
And you have no memory
I
of it?
have no memory of it. But that's what started the whole spree all over again.
On the morning of May 27, 1991, Milwaukee police responded to an alarming call. Two women had encountered a naked boy on the street who was disoriented and bleeding. But as the police arrived at the scene, a handsome blonde man approached and assured them all was well. But that man was the notorious serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer. Dahmer calmly told the police officers that the boy was 19 years old and his lover. In reality, Konorak Synthesumphone was just 14. And he was about to become Dahmer's latest victim. But the officers believed Jeffrey Dahmer. Although the women tried to object, they were told to shut the hell up and but out of this domestic dispute. On their way back to the station, the officers joked about the gay lovers, completely unaware that they just allowed a murder to happen. It was but one of 17 murders that Dahmer would commit between 1978 and 1991. Before long, the 31-year-old Dahmer was arrested and charged with murdering Synthesumphone, along with other men and boys. Tragically, Jeffrey Dahmer's victims were often young, ranging in age from 14 to 31. This is the revolting story of a cannibalistic serial killer, and how he finally got caught red-handed. Jeffrey Dahmer was born May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the first of two sons to Lionel Herbert Dahmer, a Marquette University chemistry student and later a research chemist, and Joyce Annette Dahmer, a teletype machine instructor. Lionel is of German and Welsh ancestry, and Joyce was of Norwegian and Irish ancestry. At a young age, he became fascinated with all things related to death and began collecting the carcasses of dead animals. Eerily, Dahmer's father noted how his son was oddly thrilled by the sounds of clanking animal bones. By the time Dahmer was in high school, his family had moved to Bath Township, a sleepy suburb of Akron, Ohio. There, Dahmer was an outcast who quickly became an alcoholic. He drank heavily at school, often hiding beer and hard liquor in his army fatigue jacket. To fit in, Dahmer would often pull practical jokes, like pretending to have seizures. He would do this so frequently that pulling off a good practical joke became known around the school as doing a Dahmer. During this time, Jeffrey Dahmer also realized that he was gay. As his sexuality blossomed, so too did his increasingly abnormal sexual fantasies. Dahmer began fantasizing about raping men and became aroused by the idea of completely dominating and controlling another person. As Dahmer's violent fantasies grew stronger, his control weakened. Just weeks after he graduated high school, Dahmer committed his first murder. Jeffrey Dahmer's parents divorced the same year he graduated high school. Dahmer's brother and his father decided to move into a nearby motel, and Dahmer and his mother continued living at the Dahmer family home. Whenever Dahmer's mother was out of town, he had full control of the house. On one such occasion, Dahmer took advantage of his newfound freedom. He picked up 18-year-old hitchhiker Stephen Mark Hicks, who was on his way to a rock concert in nearby Lockwood Corners. Dahmer convinced Hicks to join him at his house for some drinks before he went to the show. After hours of drinking and listening to music, Hicks attempted to leave, a move that enraged Dahmer. In response, Dahmer bludgeoned Hicks from behind with a 10-pound dumbbell and strangled him to death. He then stripped Hicks naked and masturbated on his lifeless corpse. Then, Dahmer brought Hicks down to the crawl space of his house and began dissecting the body. Afterward, Dahmer removed the bones, smashed them to powder, and dissolved the flesh with acid. Jeffrey Dahmer's murders had begun. But on the surface, Dahmer seemed to be a normal young man who was struggling to figure his life out. He briefly attended Ohio State University but dropped out after one term due to his drinking. He also served as a combat medic in the U.S. Army for 2 years before his alcoholism became a problem. After being honorably discharged, he returned to his grandmother's house in West Allis, a suburb of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It would later come to light that Dahmer had drugged and raped 2 other soldiers. As a civilian, Dahmer's violence continued. He committed numerous sex crimes, including masturbating in front of children and drugging and raping men at gay bathhouses. In September 1987, Dahmer escalated back to murder when he killed 25-year-old Stephen Twomey. Dahmer met Twomey at a bar and convinced the young man to go back to his hotel room with him. Dahmer later claimed that he had just intended to drug and rape the man, but awoke the next morning to find his hand bruised and Twomey's bloodied corpse underneath his bed. Jeffrey Dahmer's murder of Stephen Twomey was the catalyst that sparked Dahmer's true killing spree. After that heinous crime, he began actively seeking out young men at gay bars and luring them back to his grandmother's house. There, he would drug, rape, and kill them. Dahmer killed at least 3 victims during this time. He was also arrested for the molestation of a 13-year-old boy. Due to that charge, Dahmer would serve 8 months in a work camp. Still, the idea of killing consumed him. It was an incessant and never-ending desire to be with someone at whatever cost, he later said.
Yes, but that's how strong the compulsion was. That's how bizarre the desire was. I wanted to keep something of the person with me.
But murder alone wasn't enough. Dahmer also began to collect grotesque trophies from his victims. This practice began with the murder of a 24-year-old aspiring model named Anthony Sears. Sears struck up a conversation with the seemingly innocent Dahmer at a gay bar. After going home with Dahmer, Sears was drugged, raped, and eventually strangled. Dahmer would then preserve Spears' head and genitals in jars filled with acetone. When he moved into his own place downtown, Dahmer brought the dismembered pieces of Sears with him. Over the next 2 years, Dahmer committed the bulk of his 17 murders. He would lure young men back to his home, often offering them money to pose nude for him before killing them. As Jeffrey Dahmer's murders continued, his depravity deepened. After taking photos of the corpses and dissolving their flesh and bones, Dahmer would regularly keep the skulls of his victims as trophies. He also began experimenting with various techniques to preserve these grisly mementos. He once even accidentally exploded the head of one of his victims, Edward Smith, when he tried to dry it out in the oven. Around the same time, Dahmer began to dabble in cannibalism. He kept body parts in the refrigerator so that he could feast on them later. But even that wasn't enough to satisfy Dahmer's sickening urges. He also began drilling holes into the heads of his victims while they were drugged and still alive. He would then pour hydrochloric acid onto his victim's brain, a technique that he hoped would put the person in a permanent, unresistant, and submissive state. He attempted this procedure with numerous victims, including Cynthia Sumphone. That's why, along with being drugged, the boy was unable to communicate with the police and ask for help. Dahmer's most violent fantasies had slithered from nightmares to reality. But he hid it well. His parole officer didn't suspect a thing. And Jeffrey Dahmer's victims often didn't realize what was happening until it was too late. On July 22, 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer went after 32-year-old Tracy Edwards. Like he did with many of his victims, Dahmer offered Edwards money to pose for nude photos in his apartment. But to the shock of Edwards, Dahmer handcuffed him and threatened him with a knife, telling him to undress. Dahmer then taunted Edwards, telling him that he was going to eat his heart. Dahmer placed his ear against Edwards' chest and rocked back and forth. Terrified, Edwards attempted to appease Dahmer, telling him that he was his friend and that he would watch TV with him. While Dahmer was distracted, Edwards punched him in the face and ran out the door, escaping the fate of becoming another one of Jeffrey Dahmer's murder victims. Edwards flagged down a police car and led the officers to Dahmer's apartment. There, a policeman discovered photos of dismembered corpses, which were clearly taken in the same exact apartment that they were now standing in. "These are for real," said the officer who uncovered the photos, as he handed them to his partner. Though Dahmer attempted to resist arrest, he was quickly detained. Upon closer inspection of the apartment, the police found 4 severed heads in the kitchen and a total of 7 skulls, many of them painted. In the fridge, they found numerous body parts, including 2 human hearts. In the bedroom, they found a 57-gallon drum, and quickly noticed an overpowering odor emanating from it. When they looked inside, they found 3 dismembered human torsos dissolving in an acid solution. The apartment was filled with so many human body parts that were stored and arranged with such care that the medical examiner later said, it was more like dismantling someone's museum than an actual crime scene. Dahmer was arrested, and it didn't take long for him to admit to all 17 of his murders. But despite his unspeakable crimes, Dahmer was found to be sane during his 1992 trial. Some disagreed with the declaration of sanity, including at least one other serial killer. When John Wayne Gacy was asked what he thought of Dahmer, he said,
"What do I think of Jeffrey Dahmer? I don't know the man personally, but I'll tell you this, that's a good example as to why insanity doesn't belong in a courtroom. Because if Jeffrey Dahmer doesn't meet the requirements for insanity, then I'd hate like hell to run into the guy that does."
At Dahmer's trial, he pled guilty to 15 of the charges against him and was given 15 life sentences plus 70 years. He would spend the next 3 years in prison at Wisconsin's Columbia Correctional Institution, where he would be interviewed by the media multiple times. Unsurprisingly, he quickly became infamous as one of the worst serial killers in modern history. During his time in prison, Dahmer had constant thoughts of suicide, but he would never get the chance to take his own life. On November 28, 1994, a fellow inmate and convicted murderer named Christopher Scarver beat Dahmer to death with a metal bar in the prison bathroom. According to Scarver, Jeffrey Dahmer neither fought back nor made a sound during the attack, but instead appeared to accept his fate. If he'd have had a choice, he'd have let this happen to him, Dahmer's mother told the Milwaukee Sentinel soon afterward. "I always asked if he was safe, and he'd say, 'It doesn't matter, Mom. I don't care if something happens to me. Now is everybody happy?'" Joyce Dahmer asked. "Now that he's bludgeoned to death, is that good enough for everyone?" Thank you so much for watching the whole video. If you had fun or learned anything, do me a favor, like, subscribe, comment, share.